On a scorching August morning in 1972, in the small town of Refugio, Texas, a young woman named Patricia Ann Morrison vanished from her modest wood frame house on the edge of town. She was 23 years old, a mother of two small children, married to a local ranch hand named Dale Morrison. By noon that day, neighbors noticed her clothesline still hung with damp sheets, her back door standing open to the relentless heat, and her car sitting untouched in the gravel driveway. Her children, ages 4 and 2, were found alone in the house, the youngest still in his crib, crying. Patricia Morrison was never seen alive again. The question that would haunt Refugio County for nearly 5 decades was deceptively simple. Where did Patricia go, and who knew the truth all along? Refugio sits in the coastal bend of Texas, about 40 miles north of Corpus Christi, where the land flattens out into a patchwork of cattle ranches, cotton fields, and struggling farms. In 1972, the population hovered around 4,000 souls, mostly families who had worked the same land for generations. The town center consisted of a courthouse square, a handful of stores, 2 gas stations, and 3 churches that filled every Sunday without fail. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets were hard to keep, or so people believed. The Morrison family lived in a rental house on County Road 347, a narrow strip of asphalt that connected the main highway to a series of small properties scattered across the prairie. The house itself was unremarkable, painted white once but faded to a dull gray by the sun and wind. A chain-link fence enclosed a small yard, where Patricia's children played on a metal swing set that creaked in the constant breeze. Dale Morrison worked at the Bennett Ranch, tending cattle and mending fences, a job that paid little but came with the house. Patricia stayed home with the children, tended a small vegetable garden, and occasionally helped her mother at the Refugio diner on weekends. Those who knew Patricia described her as quiet, dutiful, perhaps a little timid. She had married Dale Morrison when she was 19, already pregnant with their first child, a daughter they named Amy. Their son, Michael, arrived 18 months later. Neighbors said Patricia kept to herself mostly, though she was unfailingly polite when encountered at the grocery store or the post office. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, favored simple cotton dresses, and rarely wore makeup. Her mother, Eleanor Webb, who still lived in town, visited twice a week, bringing groceries and staying to help with the children. Dale Morrison was harder to read. At 26, he was lean and sunburned, with calloused hands and a tendency to keep his opinions to himself. He worked long hours at the ranch, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark. On weekends, he could be found at the Lone Star Tavern on the highway, drinking beer with other ranch hands and playing pool. Those who worked alongside him said he was reliable, never complained, and kept his distance from gossip. Others noted that he had a temper, though it rarely showed in public. August 14, 1972, began like most summer days in Refugio County. The temperature climbed into the high 90s by mid-morning, and the sky stretched cloudless and white with heat. Patricia Morrison rose early, as she always did, and made breakfast for Dale before he left for work. He drove away in his dusty Ford pickup at 6:15, as confirmed later by the odometer reading and statements from ranch employees who saw him arrive at 6:45. Patricia fed the children, settled them in the living room with toys, and began her morning routine. The clothesline outside bore witness to her last known activity. Neighbors would later recall seeing the sheets and towels hanging in the still air around 8:30 in the morning. The postal carrier, making his rounds at 9:15, noticed Patricia's car in the driveway and the front curtains drawn against the heat, nothing unusual. But when Eleanor Webb arrived at 11 o'clock for her regular Tuesday visit, she found the back door standing open, flies buzzing through the kitchen. and the house eerily quiet except for Michael's crying from the upstairs bedroom. Alina's scream brought the nearest neighbor, Mrs. Darlene Foster, running across the field. Together they searched the house, calling Patricia's name, checking every room, the cellar, the detached garage. Amy, the 4-year-old, sat on the living room floor, playing with her dolls, seemingly unbothered. When Alina asked where her mother was, Amy said simply, "Mama went away." Michael, barely 2, could offer nothing but tears and outstretched arms. Alina Webb telephoned the Refugio County Sheriff's Department at 11:23. The call log recorded her voice as panicked but coherent. "My daughter is missing. Her children are here alone. Something terrible has happened." Deputy Sheriff Raymond Caldwell arrived at the Morrison house 12 minutes later, followed shortly by Sheriff Frank Hollis himself. What they found troubled them immediately. Patricia's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet inside with $17 in cash. Her car keys hung on the hook by the door. The breakfast dishes were washed and stacked in the drainer. A pot of coffee sat cold on the stove, half full. Everything suggested a woman who had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. But there were details that didn't fit the narrative of a simple disappearance. In the bedroom, Patricia's bed was unmade, unusual for a woman neighbors described as meticulous about housekeeping. A chair was overturned in the kitchen, lying on its side near the back door. And in the bathroom, deputies found a towel on the floor, damp and streaked with what appeared to be dirt or perhaps mud, though it hadn't rained in Refugio County for 3 weeks. Sheriff Hollis called for a search party within the hour. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, more than 50 volunteers had assembled at the Morrison property. They spread out across the surrounding fields and pastures, walking in lines, calling Patricia's name, checking irrigation ditches and cattle ponds. The August heat was punishing. Men removed their hats to wipe sweat from their faces, then replaced them and kept walking. Women from the churches arrived with coolers of water and sweet tea. The search continued until darkness fell, then resumed at first light the next morning. Dale Morrison returned from the ranch at his usual time, around 6:30 that evening. Several witnesses later described his reaction when deputies informed him of his wife's disappearance. He stood in the driveway, still in his work clothes, and listened without interruption. When they finished, he said, "She's probably visiting someone." Deputies explained that her car was still there, her purse, her money. Dale looked at the house for a long moment, then said, "I don't know where she'd go." His voice, according to Deputy Caldwell's later testimony, was flat, almost empty of emotion. That night, while volunteers continued searching by flashlight and floodlamp, Dale Morrison stayed in the house with his children. Neighbors offered to take the kids, to give him space to process what was happening, but he declined. Alina Webb insisted on staying, sleeping on the couch, listening through the walls as Dale moved about the house. She would later tell investigators that she heard him pacing, heard drawers opening and closing, heard the squeak of the back door opening sometime after midnight. When she got up to check, he was standing in the yard, smoking a cigarette, staring out toward the dark fields. The search expanded over the following days. Texas Rangers joined the effort, bringing tracking dogs that followed scent trails from the house to the county road, then lost the trail entirely. Divers searched stock ponds within a 2-mile radius. Volunteers checked abandoned buildings, old wells, drainage culverts. The media descended on Refugio, transforming the quiet town into a spectacle of news vans and reporters shouting questions at anyone willing to talk. Patricia's photograph appeared in newspapers across South Texas, a young woman with dark eyes and a tentative smile, looking directly at the camera. Investigators began to notice inconsistencies. Dale Morrison's timeline of his movements on August 14th seemed straightforward at first. He left for work at 6:15, arrived at the ranch at 6:45, worked through the morning repairing fences in the south pasture, broke for lunch at the ranch house at noon, returned to work until 5:30, then drove home. Ranch foreman Carl Bennett confirmed seeing Dale throughout the day, but when investigators measured the distance from the Morrison house to the Bennett ranch, they found it was only 14 miles. The drive should have taken no more than 20 minutes, yet Dale's timeline showed a 30-minute commute. Deputies asked Dale about the discrepancy. He shrugged and said he drove slow, liked to listen to the radio. They asked which route he took. He described taking the county road straight to the ranch, the most direct path. They asked if anyone saw him on the road that morning. He said he didn't know, he didn't pay attention to other cars. His answers were consistent but oddly lacking in detail, as if he were describing someone else's routine rather than his own. Clear's throat then, there was the matter of the clothes. On the morning Patricia disappeared, Dale had worn his usual work outfit: denim jeans, a chambray shirt, steel-toed boots. When he arrived at the ranch, Carl Bennett noticed the shirt looked fresh, recently washed and ironed. This was unusual, Bennett said, because Dale typically wore his work clothes multiple days before washing them. When asked about it later, Dale said Patricia had done laundry the night before. But Alina Webb insisted she had visited her daughter on Monday evening, and the laundry basket had been full. Patricia had planned to wash clothes on Tuesday morning. The investigation took a darker turn when deputies found disturbed earth in a remote corner of the property, about 200 yards behind the house, near an old cistern that hadn't been used in years. The ground showed signs of recent digging, the dirt looser and lighter in color than the surrounding soil. Sheriff Hollies ordered an excavation. On August 19th, 5 days after Patricia's disappearance, they began to dig. The work proceeded slowly in the relentless heat. Deputies removed earth one shovel at a time, sifting through the soil for any evidence. By late afternoon, at a depth of approximately 4 feet, they found Patricia Ann Morrison. She was buried face down, still wearing the simple floral dress she had been seen in the day before she vanished. The coroner, Dr. James Fielding, conducted a preliminary examination at the scene. Patricia had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of her head, a single devastating blow that fractured her skull. There were defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, indicating she had tried to protect herself. Time of death was estimated between 6 and 10 hours before discovery of her absence, placing it in the early morning hours of August 14th. News of the discovery spread through Refugio within minutes. The small community, which had held on to hope that Patricia might be found alive, plunged into grief and shock. But alongside the sadness came whispers, speculation, and a growing sense of unease. Everyone knew there were only a limited number of people who could have buried Patricia Morrison in that specific location. The spot was not visible from the road, not easily accessible unless you knew the property, and the fresh digging meant the burial had occurred recently, likely the same day Patricia went missing. Dale Morrison was brought in for questioning on August 20th. He sat across from Sheriff Hollies and Texas Ranger Marcus Webb in a small interview room at the courthouse. The session lasted 4 hours. According to the official report, Dale maintained his innocence throughout. He expressed shock at finding his wife deceased. He stated repeatedly that he had been at work all day, that dozens of people could confirm his whereabouts. When asked if he knew of anyone who might want to harm Patricia, he said no, she had no enemies, everyone liked her. But investigators noted his demeanor. He did not cry. He did not raise his voice or show anger at whoever had done this terrible thing. He answered questions in the same flat tone, his face expressionless, his hands folded calmly on the table. Those who knew him said this was simply Dale's way, that he had never been demonstrative with emotions. Others found his composure deeply unsettling. Deputy Caldwell wrote in his notes, "Subject shows no visible distress, maintains eye contact but offers no additional information beyond direct answers to questions." When shown photograph of deceased wife, no observable reaction. The forensic evidence was limited by the standards that would emerge in later decades. There were no security cameras, no cell phone records, no DNA analysis. What investigators had were the physical facts of the burial site, the timeline, and witness statements. The coroner determined Patricia had been struck from behind, likely with a blunt object, possibly a shovel or length of pipe. No weapon was found. The disturbed earth around the burial site showed boot prints, but they were generic work boots, the kind half the men in Refugio County wore. There were no fingerprints, no fibers, no clear physical evidence linking anyone to the crime. Investigators focused on motive and opportunity. Dale Morrison had both. Neighbors, when pressed, admitted the marriage had seemed strained. Patricia's mother acknowledged her daughter had confided that Dale sometimes frightened her, though she provided no specifics. A waitress at the Lone Star Tavern mentioned that Dale had been seen talking with another woman on several occasions, though nothing overtly inappropriate. Financial records showed the Morrisons were struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, but there was no insurance policy on Patricia that might suggest a financial motive. The case stalled. Without physical evidence or a confession, the district attorney declined to file charges. Dale Morrison remained free, living in the house where his wife had been taken from, raising their 2 children with the help of his mother-in-law, who moved in despite her deep suspicions. The community fractured into factions. Some believed Dale was guilty, that only he could have committed the crime. Others argued the lack of evidence spoke for itself, that rushing to judgment based on suspicion was wrong. The Morrison children became tragic figures, whispered about in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. As autumn arrived and the heat finally broke, the investigation slowed to a crawl. Sheriff Hollies kept the case file open, but with no new leads, there was little to pursue. The Texas Rangers moved on to other cases. The media lost interest. Refugio returned to its rhythms, though something fundamental had changed. A young mother had been taken violently from her home and buried in secret, and whoever had done it walked among them, unpunished. Clear's throat, the years that followed Patricia Morrison's death, unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything her family had been. Dale continued working at the Bennett Ranch, showing up each morning, doing his job, speaking little. Amy and Michael grew up in the house on County Road 347, raised primarily by their grandmother Eleanor, who never stopped watching Dale with eyes full of questions she couldn't prove answers to. The children learned early not to ask about their mother. Photographs of Patricia disappeared from the walls, packed away in boxes Eleanor kept hidden in her room. The silence around her death became a weight the entire household carried. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, you understand the particular hell Eleanor Webb inhabited. She lived under the same roof as the man she believed had taken her daughter's life, caring for his children because someone had to, cooking meals across the table from him, listening to his footsteps in the hall at night. She stayed because leaving felt like abandoning Patricia's memory, like giving up on some future moment when the truth might finally surface. Amy Morrison began having nightmares when she was 6 years old. She would wake screaming, calling for her mother, and Eleanor would rush to her bedside and hold her until the trembling stopped. When asked what she dreamed about, Amy would only say the bad morning, a phrase that chilled Eleanor to her core. What did a 4-year-old remember? What had she seen that August day before her mother vanished? Eleanor asked gently, carefully, but Amy would only shake her head and go silent, her small face closing off like a door swinging shut. Michael, too young to remember his mother, grew into a quiet, watchful child. Teachers noted that he rarely smiled, that he preferred solitary activities, building elaborate structures with blocks in the corner of the classroom while other children played. At home, he followed Alina everywhere, a shadow that never strayed far. Dale tried occasionally to engage with his son, taking him out to the truck, showing him tools, attempting some version of fatherhood. Michael endured these moments with visible discomfort, his body tense, his responses monosyllabic. The marriage that never was dissolved officially in 1978, 6 years after Patricia's death. Alina filed for legal guardianship of Amy and Michael, citing Dale's inability to properly care for the children. Dale did not contest it. The hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. The judge granted Alina full custody, and Dale moved out of the house on County Road 347 into a small apartment above the hardware store in town. He continued working at the ranch, continued his routine of solitude and silence. Those few who still spoke to him said he seemed almost relieved to be unburdened of the daily pretense of family life. But the case was never truly cold in Alina Webb's mind. She kept her own files, newspaper clippings, notes from conversations with investigators, observations she recorded meticulously in a journal she started the week Patricia died. She wrote about the inconsistencies, the questions that had never been adequately answered. Why had Dale's shirt been freshly laundered that morning? Where had those extra 10 minutes in his commute gone? Who had turned over the kitchen chair? She wrote about Patricia's fears, vague comments her daughter had made in the months before her death about feeling watched, about Dale's increasingly distant moods. In 1985, 13 years after Patricia's death, a development emerged that seemed insignificant at first but would eventually crack the case open. A woman named Ruth Callahan, who had worked as a secretary at the Bennett Ranch in the early 70s, contacted the Refugio County Sheriff's Department with information she said had been bothering her conscience for years. She had kept silent because she was married at the time and had been involved in an inappropriate relationship with one of the ranch hands. That ranch hand was Dale Morrison. According to Ruth's statement, she and Dale had been having a relationship for approximately 6 months leading up to Patricia's death. They met in secret, usually at a motel in the neighboring county. Dale had told Ruth his marriage was essentially over, that he and Patricia barely spoke, that he was only staying for the children. Ruth claimed she had broken off the relationship 2 weeks before Patricia disappeared, because Dale had become possessive and volatile. When Patricia's body was found, Ruth said she immediately suspected Dale, but was too afraid and ashamed to come forward. The sheriff at the time, no longer Frank Hollies who had retired, was a younger man named Thomas Rivera. He listened to Ruth's statement and reopened the investigation. But even with this new information, building a prosecutable case remained difficult. Ruth's testimony about the relationship provided motive, but it was 13 years old, uncorroborated, and complicated by her own admitted secrecy and potential biases. Defense attorneys would tear it apart. Rivera needed more. Clear's throat, what he got came from an unexpected source. Amy Morrison was 17 years old in 1985, preparing to graduate from Refugio High School. She had grown into a reserved young woman, studious and serious, planning to attend college in San Antonio and escape the town where her mother's ghost still lingered. She lived with Alina, rarely saw her father, and had never spoken publicly about her mother's death. But something about Ruth Callahan's statement, which was reported in the local newspaper, triggered a memory that Amy had suppressed for 13 years. On September 12, 1985, Amy walked into the Refugio County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about her mother's case. Deputy Linda Vasquez, one of the first female deputies in the county, sat down with Amy in a private room. What Amy revealed that day would change everything. Amy said she remembered the morning her mother died more clearly than she had ever admitted. She remembered waking early to voices in the kitchen, her parents arguing. This was not unusual. But the tone had been different that morning, sharper, more frightened in her mother's voice. Amy had crept to the top of the stairs and looked down into the kitchen. She saw her father and mother standing near the back door. Her mother was crying. Her father was holding something in his hand, something long and dark that Amy thought might have been a piece of pipe from the garage. Then Amy said her father had told her mother to go outside, and they had both walked through the back door into the yard. Amy had watched from the window. She saw them walk toward the back of the property, toward where the old cistern stood among the weeds and mesquite trees. She watched until they disappeared from view. Then she had gone back to her room, climbed into bed, and waited. She waited for what felt like hours. Eventually, she heard the back door open again. She heard her father's footsteps coming up the stairs. He had looked into her room, seen her lying there with her eyes closed, and pulled the door shut. She heard the shower running for a long time. When she finally came downstairs later that morning, her mother was gone. Amy's hands shook as she told this story. Deputy Vasquez asked gently why she had never said anything before. Amy said she had been 4 years old, terrified, and had convinced herself over the years that she had dreamed it, that it couldn't be real. But Ruth Callahan's statement had brought it all back with terrible clarity. She knew what she had seen. Her father had taken her mother out to that back field. Her mother had never come back. And Amy had remained silent for 13 years because she was a child who didn't understand, and then a teenager too afraid of what the truth would mean. On October 3, 1985, Dale Morrison was arrested at the Bennett Ranch and charged with the murder of Patricia Ann Morrison. He was 40 years old, still lean and weathered, his hair graying at the temples. When deputies read him his rights, he said nothing. When they asked if he wanted to call an attorney, he nodded once. He was transported to the county jail, where he sat in a cell and stared at the wall, speaking to no one. The arrest stunned what remained of the community that remembered Patricia's death. Some felt vindication, a sense that justice delayed was still justice. Others expressed skepticism about a case built largely on the recovered memories of a traumatized child, now a young woman, testifying about events from 13 years ago. The trial, when it began in February 1986, became the most significant criminal proceeding in Refugio County history. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Torres, built their case methodically. They presented the timeline of August 14, 1972, highlighting the inconsistencies in Dale's whereabouts. They called Carl Bennett, who testified about the freshly laundered shirt Dale had worn that morning, unusual for a man who typically wore work clothes multiple days. They presented testimony from neighbors about the strained marriage, from Ruth Callahan about the secret relationship and Dale's increasingly possessive behavior, from Alina Webb about her daughter's subtle fears in the weeks before her death. But the centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Amy Morrison herself. Now 18 years old, she took the stand on the trial's 5th day. The courtroom was packed, spectators standing along the walls, reporters filling the front rows. Amy wore a simple navy dress, her dark hair pulled back, and she looked frighteningly small in the witness chair. She spoke in a steady voice, describing what she remembered from that August morning. She described the argument, the pipe in her father's hand, watching them walk toward the back field, the long silence that followed, her father returning alone. Defense attorney Robert Hendricks cross-examined her carefully. He asked about the passage of time, the unreliability of childhood memory, the possibility of suggestion and reconstruction. He pointed out that Amy had never mentioned any of this in the original investigation, that she had lived with her grandmother, who deeply suspected Dale. That years of that environment could have shaped her recollections. Amy listened to each question and answered thoughtfully. She said she understood how it looked. She said she had doubted herself for years. But what she remembered clearly, and it had been eating away at her conscience since the day it happened. The jury also heard from the coroner, Dr. James Fielding, now retired but still sharp in his recollections. He testified about the single devastating blow to Patricia's skull, the defensive wounds, the burial in the shallow grave. He acknowledged that the murder weapon had never been found, but the injury pattern was consistent with something like a metal pipe or heavy tool handle. Dale Morrison did not testify in his own defense. His attorney argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial, built on inference and the questionable memories of a child. He pointed out that no physical evidence linked Dale to the crime, that the timeline could be explained, that unhappy marriages did not equal murder. He suggested alternative theories, a drifter passing through, a random act of violence. Though these suggestions felt hollow given the intimate knowledge of the property required to bury Patricia where she was found. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On February 23, 1986, they returned a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. Dale Morrison stood as the verdict was read, his face expressionless as always. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Dale was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, and he did not look at his children, who sat beside Alina in the second row. The community's reaction was mixed. Some felt relief that Patricia had finally received justice, that her death had not been forgotten or forgiven. Others remained troubled by the reliance on Amy's testimony, wondering if memory could truly be trusted after so many years. Alina Webb, who had waited 14 years for this moment, wept quietly in the courtroom, her hands covering her face. Amy and Michael Morrison left Refugio shortly after the trial. Amy went to college as planned, eventually becoming a social worker specializing in trauma counseling. Michael joined the military, seeking distance and structure. They rarely spoke about their father or the trial, or the mother they barely remembered. Alina remained in Refugio until her death in 1994, living alone in the house on County Road 347, keeping Patricia's photographs on the walls once more. Speaking her daughter's name aloud each day, so she would never be forgotten. Dale Morrison served his sentence at the Huntsville unit, maintaining his innocence but never speaking publicly about the case. He died in prison in 2003 at the age of 58 from complications related to cancer. He never confessed. He never provided details about what happened that morning or why. The truth as he knew it went with him. Clear's throat. The case of Patricia Ann Morrison remains a testament to persistence and the long arc of justice. It demonstrates that cold cases can be solved, that time does not erase truth, and that victims can still speak through those who loved them and refuse to stop asking questions. Patricia was 23 years old when her life was taken, a young mother with 2 small children, a woman described as kind and quiet, whose only crime was marrying the wrong man. Her story matters because she mattered, because the years of silence did not diminish the value of her life or the obligation to seek justice on her behalf. The case reminds us that sometimes the answer to who committed a terrible crime is simple and close to home, and that children carry burdens no child should have to bear. Amy Morrison's courage in finally speaking the truth, despite years of fear and self-doubt, gave her mother a voice when all other voices had grown quiet. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.